Welcome to lecture 6. So we will continue on efficiency and equity, and we will dive into these two topics in more detail in this lecture. The prescribed reading is chapter 7 for this material of Stiglitz and Rosengard. So specifically what this lecture covers is efficiency and distribution trade-offs, social choices, analysis thereof, and also social choices in practices, which we'll discuss in greater detail. So consider the following situation. Consider an economy with two individuals. We have Crusoe and we have Friday. And initially Crusoe has 10 oranges and Friday has only 2 oranges. So this is a situation that we are starting with. So as you can see, this is rather an inequitable situation. Why? Because Crusoe seems to have all the oranges in the economy, whereas Friday has only 2. Now this is when government can intervene. What government can do is it can intervene in order to redistribute oranges such that a more equitable outcome is achieved and the level of inequity in the economy is achieved. So what is the course of action that government takes? Well, government decides to take 4 oranges from Crusoe and transfer these to Friday. So ideally both should have 6 oranges each now, right? So government would have eliminated inequity. However, the problem that arises is that one of these oranges gets lost. So essentially what this represents is a loss of efficiency. And what this presents is a problem whereby the trade-off between efficiency and equity results in the reduction of inequity, in other words, the improvement in equity, but also a reduction in efficiency. So hence there's a trade-off. High equity means lower efficiency. And this trade-off between equity and efficiency is often at the heart of many debates in the public discourse. And there's 2 specific questions that are debated. So first of all, what is the trade-off between equity and efficiency? How much efficiency must be given up in order to achieve equity? This is something that is not really well quantified, or perhaps maybe still disputed. In other words, some parties might argue that a lot of efficiency has to be given up in order to achieve equity, whereas others argue that the trade-off is rather small. Okay, so that is the first problem that we face. The other argument is, which of these is more important? Is it inequality or efficiency that is most important? Some argue that regardless of what the impact is on efficiency, what we should focus on is inequality. We should reduce inequality regardless of what happens to efficiency. Others argue that we shouldn't really worry about how the pie is divided. Instead, what we should worry is about increasing the size of the pie. In other words, we shouldn't worry about the level of inequality. What we should instead worry about is efficiency. So the idea would be to increase efficiency overall. So how do we analyze public choice? Well, let's go back to the earlier chapters. In the earlier chapters, what we essentially introduced is a possibilities production frontier. So given a mix of resources, we could land up on a specific possibilities production schedule. We could produce at a certain level. Now think about it a little bit differently. So let's say we have a number of goods in the economy. And these goods can be redistributed between individuals. In our example, that will be Crusoe and Friday. So the idea is that we can consume, given the mix of goods, we can consume on a utility possibilities curve. On this utility possibilities curve, some individuals in the economy can consume less and others can consume more. And through redistribution, we can move along the utility possibilities curve. So what the utility possibilities curve does, it gives us the highest level of utility attainable by an individual given the levels of utility attained by others. So essentially this is an equivalent of a production possibilities frontier. But now what we are doing is we are redistributing goods that we have in the economy in order to describe a utility possibilities curve. And in a Pareto efficient economy, one would be operating along the utility possibilities schedule. So that is the idea there. And this brings us to the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which states that competitive economies are always on the utility possibility schedule. Second of all, the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics states that every point on the utility possibility schedule can be attained through a competitive market process if the government redistributes initial endowments accordingly. So we can move along the utility possibilities curve, provided that there is a redistribution of goods. This will become clearer as to how this works on the next slide. That's what we will deal with. So now we need to introduce a second concept to our framework, and that is a so-called social indifference curve. So remember what we had previously, what we had individual curves for individual consumers. And now what we have is indifference curves for the whole of society. And what these social indifference curves do is they describe how society evaluates trade-offs between utility levels of different individuals. And we bring this together on the next slide, so stay tuned. So what the social indifference curve does is it gives us a combination, or describes combinations of utility that Crusoe and Friday can, amongst which they are indifferent, can attain for given combinations of goods. So let's start with the utility possibilities curve. So this is the utility possibilities curve, which essentially represents the utilities that are possible, or the combination of utilities that are possible for Friday and also Crusoe. So in this instance, Friday, at this point, Friday would have a higher utility than Crusoe. Okay, so that distance for Crusoe is a lot smaller than this distance for Friday. So initially, let's say that we have a competitive market equilibrium at point A. So at this point, we are on indifference curve, or social indifference curve, specifically S subscript 0. Now note, remember the concept, or remember the principle, the higher the indifference curve, the better. So in there, what ideally we would like to do is we would like to be at S subscript 1. So hence, we would like our equilibrium to be at point B. But what does this require? Well, what this requires is that there is a trade-off in utility and that there is a redistribution of goods. Specifically, what would have to happen is that we have to increase Friday's utility, and what we have to do is we have to decrease Crusoe's utility. So we have to go from this point, point A, to point B. Friday now has a higher utility, and Crusoe has now a lower level of utility. That is the question. What is the trade-off? That's the first question we need to ask. Second of all, how does society evaluate the trade-off? So the point that is preferred ultimately is point B, and the reason why is because it relies on a high indifference curve. So now let's zoom in onto the trade-off that is required in order to move from point A to point B. So again, initially we start off with an economy which is biased, let's call it that, or favors Crusoe. Crusoe has a greater level of utility relative to Friday. However, as a result of that, as seen on the previous slide, we are on a lower social indifference curve. So you could be better off through a redistribution. So what is it that happens now if we are at this point? Well, in order to move to point B, what we need to do is we need to distribute or redistribute goods away from Crusoe to Friday. So we need to give Friday more goods. So what is it that happens? This makes Crusoe worse off. So essentially, Crusoe now has a lower utility. So hence, this is the decrease in Crusoe's utility. But on the other hand, Friday experiences a much larger increase in utility relative to the decrease of Crusoe's utility. So in other words, decreases in Crusoe's utility are small in comparison to increases in Friday's utility. So yes, Crusoe does lose, but Friday gains a lot more. So that's the first important point that we need to be aware of. Note what happened on the previous slide. What we essentially had is we had a big increase in Friday's utility and a small decrease through redistribution in Crusoe's utility. And that is what allowed us to be on a high indifference curve. Now, why is that? What exactly is it that happened? Well, essentially what we have is we have Friday's utility increasing. So that increase can be represented by a shift, or not a shift, but a movement along the utility curve from point A to point B. Okay, so this is an increase as Friday consumes, let's say, 21 oranges now as opposed to 20 oranges. In other words, as consumption increases by 1. And the actual increase from point A to point B is called marginal utility. So marginal utility is the satisfaction that is attained from consuming the additional unit of a good. So if you consume additional unit, yes, your total utility goes up by the marginal utility. Now, what happens when we reallocate an additional unit, well, additional orange to Friday? Again, what we have is we have an increase in total utility. However, that increase is lower. In other words, from consuming an additional orange, Friday receives less satisfaction than from the previous orange. So what we are seeing is we are seeing a diminishing marginal utility taking place. So therefore, as an individual consumes more of any other good, the extra gain from having an extra unit of that good becomes smaller. So going back to the previous slide, the way we can think about it as to why Friday receives such a high boost from additional oranges, opposed to the small loss that Crusoe experiences, is because of diminishing marginal utility. Because Crusoe has because Friday has so few goods, he experiences a much larger gain than Crusoe experiences from consuming fewer oranges. And this is because of diminishing marginal utility. So yes, each additional unit provides less satisfaction, or each additional orange provides less satisfaction to Friday, but nevertheless, because he has so little to start off with, his total utility increases by far more than the loss or the decrease in Crusoe's utility. Whereas because Crusoe has so many oranges to begin with. And that is why we have that beneficial trade-off that puts us on a higher social indifference curve. So on the previous few slides, what we assumed is that redistribution is costless, and hence there is no inefficiency that is introduced. But what happens if inefficiency is introduced, as suggested at the beginning of this lecture? Well, let's assume that we have initially costless transfers. What that allows us to do is that allows us to move along the utility possibility schedule. So hence we can have a situation as over the previous 2 or 3 slides where we move from point A by redistributing away from Crusoe to Friday, which is now at, and we'll end up at point B. But what happens if we do introduce transfers which do impact economic efficiency? So let's say what we decide to do is we decide to transfer resources away from the rich to the poor. And what is the result of that? The result of that is an introduction of inefficiency, and hence we have these points on the new utility possibility schedule with costs below the points if we had no transfer costs of resources. In other words, no longer are all the same points of utility attainable at the extremes for Friday and also Crusoe. So on the previous set of slides, what we've essentially done is we've described what trade-offs look like. Now what we need to do is we need to evaluate these trade-offs. And what we use for the purpose of this is the social welfare function, which gives us the level of social welfare corresponding to a particular set of levels of utility attained by members of society. And what the social welfare function does is it allows us or provides the basis for ranking any allocation of resources. We choose allocations that yield higher levels of social welfare. So this is exactly the same with indifference curves. We choose indifference curves that yield a higher level of satisfaction, given the limitations that we have. So that's important to remember. There's always limitations. So we then go back to social indifference curve, and as you recall, it is a set of combinations of utilities of different individuals that yield equal levels of welfare to society. Similarly, as indifference curves shows the combinations of goods that yield a similar level or the same level of satisfaction for a given individual. And what we're going to do next is we're going to see what these social indifference curves look like. So what do social indifference curves look like? Well, they look like individual indifference curves, or the indifference curves for individuals. So recall that indifference curves for individuals represented the combination of good 1 and good 2 that would yield the same level of satisfaction. The principle behind social indifference curves is the same. So combinations of utilities for different groups are represented on a given social indifference curve, implying that these utilities yield the same level of satisfaction. Specifically, these combinations of utilities for different groups yield the same levels of satisfaction. And the idea is that we always want to be on a high indifference curve. So we want to be on W subscript 2 as opposed to W subscript 1. We want to be on point B, which is on a high indifference curve, rather than point A, which is on a low indifference curve. And what one must be mindful of, and we'll see in the next slide, is that indifference curves can take on different shapes. So here what we have is we have a utilitarian social indifference curve, which is just a straight line. And this obviously differs from the indifference curves represented on the previous slide. Remember that what the slope of a social indifference curve does is it represents the trade-off. In this instance, we have a straight line, and what we assume, given a utilitarian social indifference curve, is that the trade-off is 1 unit of Friday's utility against 1 unit of Crusoe's utility. That may, of course, not always be the case, but that is when you will have a differently shaped social indifference curve. And then that allows us to also define a so-called social welfare function, which is the sum of the two utilities. So that is what we want to maximize. And the utilitarian welfare function, and that is why we have a one-to-one trade-off, indicates or implies or proposes that the utility of any individual should be weighted equally to the utility of another individual. So again, what is it that trade-offs look like on a social indifference curve? So here what we are looking at is a social indifference curve for a two individual economy. So we're looking at this indifference curve again. And the two individuals are Crusoe and also Friday. So what is it that happens? And this, we've already covered the situation, but this will lead us to discussing some arguments in terms of trade-offs, or specifically some arguments that are made when evaluating trade-offs. So what is it that happens if we reduce Friday's utility? Well, if we reduce Friday's utility, what can potentially happen? Due to the shape of an indifference curve, we will have a larger change in the utility for Crusoe. So note the shape of the indifference curve shows us or gives us a trade-off or determines the trade-offs that we receive or that arise as a result of changes in utility for one individual. So on this part, it is Crusoe that benefits for a change in utility for Friday. But on the other hand, on this part, a small change in Crusoe's utility would lead to a large change in Friday's utility. So one needs to be mindful of that. Now, what are the arguments that are presented in terms of evaluating trade-offs? Well, a number of economists argue that when one individual is worse off than the other, society is not indifferent to the decrease in the utility of the poorer individual. In other words, individual one, and that is Friday in this instance. So the argument is we do not want to make the poorer worse off and the richer better off. An alternative argument might be also that society should accept a decrease in utility of the poor only if there is a much larger increase in the marginal utility of the rich. In other words, society is not indifferent to a lowering of the utility for someone that is worse off. However, this can be offset only if the rich experience a large gain in utility, a much larger increase in utility as a result of utility for the poor decrease. So going back to the start of the explanation on this slide, given the shape of this indifference curve, what we see that the indifference curve is not a straight line, and what this implies is the specific shape of this indifference curve, and where we are on that indifference curve, implies that poor individuals become worse off, but then the rich become much better off. In other words, the increment that is gained by the rich must be a lot larger than the increment that is lost by the poor. So then what we have is a relation in the social indifference curve. And the argument here is that the welfare of society is dependent only on the welfare of the worst off individual. So therefore, society is better off because if you improve an individual's welfare, that specific individual who's worst off in society. However, it gains nothing from improving the welfare of others because the welfare is better than that of the worst off individual in society. So therefore there is no trade-off. So as oranges are transferred from Crusoe to Friday, there is no difference in how, or no impact of how many are lost in the process, as long as Friday gets something, because then he is better off. But the remainder are not gaining. So therefore, no amount of an increase in the welfare of the individual, of the better off individual, would compensate society for a decrease in the welfare of the worst off. And the result, therefore, is what we see here, the relation social indifference curve. In other words, social welfare is dependent upon the social welfare of that individual that is worst off in the economy. That is what this represents here. So to summarize, thus far what we have seen is that social indifference curves can have different shapes, and this means that there will be different outcomes in terms of trade-offs. So therefore the impact on efficiency will be different. So for example, the utilitarian curve suggests a one-to-one trade-off, whereas the relation indifference curve, social indifference curve, suggests that society is only as well off as the worst individual. Then we have an intermediate position, which is not essentially an extreme, which suggests that indeed you can have a certain segment of society benefiting from a redistribution. So what is it that governments look at then in terms of deciding upon redistribution? Well, they look at and identify the net benefits, the benefits and costs associated with redistribution. So certain groups benefit, other groups are negatively impacted by redistribution. The idea also, which is essentially the second point, this is where I'm looking at, is the need to assess whether a project results in a Pareto improvement. In other words, whether everyone else or everyone in society is better off following some kind of redistribution. And if everyone is better off without anyone being worse off, well, then what should happen is a project should be undertaken. In other words, when I say that everyone is better off, I'm meaning that society is better off as a whole, even if some people are worse off following a redistribution. But the other situation is that a project might not lead to a Pareto improvement. And then matters are a little bit more difficult because some gain and also some lose. And this is where we essentially have that discussion of inefficiency creeping in. And ultimately, it is government that needs to make a call. But remember the arguments that were presented. So some worry that inequality should always be addressed, regardless of the inefficiencies that are introduced. Others worry or look at it from a cost-benefits perspective. Should we address inequality if the cost is massive? So we go back to efficiency. How is it that we measure efficiency then? The question then is, also how do we measure equity? So efficiency is measured by summing the gains or losses for each individual. Why? Because when we redistribute in the economy, Some are better off, others are worse off. Also, equity is then measured by looking at the overall measure of inequality in society. So through redistribution, although we might lose in terms of efficiency and other individuals might gain in terms of efficiency, the idea is, have we decreased overall inequality in society? So the intention is to take up projects that have net positive efficiency effects and that reduce measured inequality. If a project achieves these two aims, in other words, that of creating net positive efficiency and also reducing measured inequality, then a project should be undertaken. We can, however, have an alternate situation when efficiency measures shows gains, but inequality measures show losses. So yes, we can increase efficiency, but that comes at the expense of equality, which implies that there is a trade-off. Then the question is then, does it make sense to increase inequality in order to increase efficiency? So carrying on from the previous slide is the question as to whether it makes sense to increase inequality if it increases inefficiency. So this is what we're going to now answer, and in order to see what the benefits of increasing efficiency at the expense of increasing inequality are, what we need to do is we need to define a further framework, and the way this is done is by looking at the willingness to pay. So first of all, what exactly is the willingness to pay? Well, willingness to pay reflects the preferences of an individual. If you like a specific good more than another good, so let's say in this example, let's say that Joe likes chocolate ice cream more than vanilla, what he will do is he will be willing to pay more for a scoop of chocolate ice cream than a scoop of vanilla. So that is an easy example. And you can view willingness to pay as a measure of utility, as represented in panel A. So that is what we have, a willingness to pay, and let's say we are dealing with sweatshirts. So what is this utility curve function showing us? Well, what it is telling us that the more sweatshirts that are purchased by our character here, Mary, what happens is that utility increases continually. In other words, total utility increases. However, again, we have marginal utility coming into play. So the idea is that although total utility increases with the consumption, purchase of each extra sweatshirt, each extra sweatshirt contributes less to total utility. So again, what we have is diminishing marginal utility. And this is what we see in panel B. Now let's recast this whole discussion in terms of a willingness to pay. Why is it that utility measures the willingness to pay? Well, think about it this way. So here we have utility and marginal utility, but stated or interpreted in terms of dollars. So Mary is willing to pay $200 for 5 sweatshirts. Think about it this way, right? So this is where we are at. Now, what is it that happens if she decides to buy a 6th sweatshirt? In other words, she is now consuming or owns a total of 6 sweatshirts. The total utility is 228. And therefore, because each additional sweatshirt is increasing her total utility, she is willing to pay for these sweatshirts because it gives her satisfaction. So the increase in utility from the 5th to the 6th sweatshirt is 28, right? And that is represented by an additional payment for the 6th sweatshirt of $28. So we essentially interpret that satisfaction as measured by utility as the willingness to pay in terms of dollars now. So that is what we are doing. Now, what is it that happens next? Well, let's say that because she is receiving utility, but now less utility from consuming the 6th sweatshirt, she is still willing to purchase an additional sweatshirt. So now she decides to consume 7 sweatshirts. What is her gain? Well, it is 24 in this instance. 26. So that is where we are at. So her total utility is increasing. In other words, she is willing to pay more and more in total for the sweatshirts that she's consuming. So hence, What this is reflecting, this increase is reflecting the additional sweatshirts and their associated utility. Now, we can interpret the marginal utility, the additional satisfaction gained from owning a sweatshirt, as the marginal willingness to pay. All right, so that is marginal utility. That's how that comes into play. Okay, in other words, we are converting a satisfaction now into a monetary value. So what we have done is essentially we've derived a special type of demand curve, something called the compensated demand curve. So the compensated demand curve essentially traces the willingness to pay that is reflected by the marginal utility curve. And what we did is we translated marginal utility into the willingness to pay on the previous slide, where we quantified or gave marginal utility and total utility a monetary value. So hence that is what allows us to arrive at the compensated demand curve. Now, what is important to understand is that the compensated demand curve and the ordinary demand curve differ. And the reason why is because the compensated demand curve reflects the reality as to how much, or reflects the willingness to pay as opposed to how much must actually be paid for a specific amount of units. So I might be willing to pay a lower price for a specific amount of units of a given good than I actually must pay if I go to buy at a shop. So with the demand curve, the ordinary demand curve specifically, as opposed to compensated demand curve, what we are looking at is what would be the quantity of sweatshirts purchased at each price. Now the question is, why is demand, or why does the quantity demanded increase as the price decreases? So why are these curves essentially downward sloping? So first of all, what we have is something called the substitution effect. So what this implies is, as the word suggests, the word substitution, is that as we lower the price of sweatshirts, Mary substitutes away from specific types of clothes, let's call them sweaters, towards sweatshirts because sweatshirts are now cheaper. So essentially think about it this way. If you have an iMac and you have an HP laptop, which one are you going to buy? If you usually buy, let's say, HP laptops, well, what happens is if the price of the iMac decreases drastically, well, there might be a chance that you might switch to buying an iMac all of a sudden. So that is a substitution effect. You are substituting away from one type of good to another type of good. And Mary's substituting away from sweaters now to sweatshirts. Why? Because sweatshirts are all of a sudden cheaper relative to sweaters. There is also another effect, and that is something called the income effect. So not only is Mary substituting away from sweaters to sweatshirts, also now because the price is lower, the price of sweatshirts, she can buy more sweatshirts. So think about it this way. Let's say you have £100 and a beer costs £5. Okay, so what happens if the cost of beer decreases by half to £2.50? Well, you can buy more beers now. Why? Because your income has greater purchasing power all of a sudden because of the decrease in price. So those are the two effects that come into play when we look at the quantity demanded. That is why our demand curves are downward sloping, because of the substitution effect and also an income effect. Now, what is it that the compensated demand curve shows us? Well, the compensated demand curve is very useful because what it does is it eliminates the income effect. And what it only reflects is the so-called substitution effect. So we could view this as controlling for the income effect. And this is why the ordinary demand curve is somewhat flatter than the compensated demand curve. Note that the quantity demanded at each price on the ordinary demand curve is greater than the quantity demanded on the compensated demand curve. And the reason why is because here, for the ordinary demand curve, we are taking both substitution and income effects into consideration, whereas the compensated demand curve only reflects the substitution effect. Now we need to define yet another concept in our framework as we build it up, and that is the so-called consumer surplus. So think about it this way. What is the benefit to a consumer? Well, how can we measure it, and why is it called a consumer surplus? So the idea basically is that the difference between what the consumer is willing to pay and what he or she actually pays is the surplus, is the gain. So let's say that Mary would be willing to pay about $50 for the first sweatshirt, $45 for the second sweatshirt, $40 for the third, $35 for the fourth, and $30 for the fifth. So let's say that the market price is 29. So that is essentially what she has to pay. So the satisfaction gained from the first sweatshirt can be quantified at $50. But in reality, what she has to pay is $29. So what is the consumer surplus? Well, it is what she is willing to pay less what she actually has to pay. So in this instance, it is $21. For the second shirt, it's $45 less $29. Again, what she has to pay, and that is equal to $16. So the consumer surplus keeps on falling. The fifth sweatshirt, remember this is related to marginal utility, specifically this number. Okay, she quantifies the satisfaction value at $30, but she has to pay $29. So the consumer surplus for the fifth sweatshirt is only $1. What is a total surplus? It is the sum of the surpluses associated with purchasing each additional unit in this instance. In other words, each additional sweatshirt. So these values that you see here, which I'm drawing a square about, summing these values gives us the total consumer surplus. So if the compensated demand curve reflects our willingness to pay, and the consumer surplus is given to us as the difference between the willingness to pay and the actual price that a consumer has to pay, it is then that the area below the compensated demand curve and above the price level represents the consumer surplus, total consumer surplus. And that is exactly what we see here. So the shaded area on this diagram indicates the total consumer surplus associated with Mary's purchases of sweatshirts. So why are we talking about consumer surpluses and the willingness to pay? Well, let's go a few lectures back. So the idea essentially is that we need to evaluate whether it is worth undertaking a project that might increase inequality but increase efficiency. Alternatively, is it worth decreasing or resulting in lower levels of efficiency, but on the other hand, leading to lower inequality, in other words, higher quality? This is why we looked at the compensated demand curve, which essentially represents our willingness to pay. So we are engaging in evaluation here. We are measuring the benefits of a government project. So let's say we are going to build a bridge. That's what we start with. So the consumer surplus that we have from building a bridge and avoiding a toll road is essentially this. So we are tracing the willingness to pay versus the amount of trips, where the willingness to pay is represented by the toll price. So in assessing alternative policies, we place an emphasis on our economic efficiency. So in order to do so, what we do is we calculate the consumer surplus associated with the elimination of the efficiency. And that is what we saw on the previous slide. How much would an individual be willing to give up to have the inefficiency eliminated? So the inefficiency was essentially going through a toll. Now that can be rectified by having a bridge or building a bridge that consumers can now use, drivers can now use. So what is the consumer surplus that is then created? Well, on the previous slide, we have a consumer surplus that we measure with the willingness to pay, which is essentially the toll price. So what is the consumer surplus given that they have to pay a toll? That's a willingness to pay. Well, we can measure that, and hence we can arrive at a consumer surplus, and that is the consumer surplus that will be created if we build a bridge. Other examples. So let's say the inefficiency that is created by a tax on cigarettes. So we ask individuals how much he or she would be willing to pay to have a tax on cigarettes eliminated. Let's say that one answer is $100. So what we then conclude is that if we eliminate a cigarette tax and instead impose a lump sum tax of $100, This results in the individual's welfare being unchanged. And this leads us to an additional concept, or a new concept, the so-called deadweight loss or excess burden, which is the difference between the revenue raised by a cigarette tax and the lump sum tax that the individual would be willing to pay. So what we measure using the deadweight loss is the inefficiency of a tax. Taxes, other than lump sum taxes, give rise to a deadweight loss because they cause individuals to forego more preferred consumption in favor of less preferred consumption to avoid the payment of a tax. So how can we measure inefficiency? Well, the idea is that essentially what we have is we have taxes that need to be used to fund certain projects. So a tax might be introduced somewhere else in the economy to, for example, fund a bridge. So what is it that happens? Well, we have inefficiency being introduced. And how do we measure these inefficiencies? So C subscript 0 is the cost of producing a cigarette. So this is where we are initially, and this is the cost of a cigarette packet, let's call it that. And the quantity that is consumed associated with this price is Q subscript 1. Now, let's say that we introduce a tax. What is it that happens? The price increases to C subscript 0 plus the tax amount. What is the result of that? The result of that is the quantity demanded decreases. So fewer cigarette packets are now consumed. Okay, but note, what is the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus is the difference between the compensated demand curve and the price. So what happens as the price increases due to the tax? We have a decrease in the consumer surplus, which corresponds to this triangle here. So what we are introducing is a deadweight loss. Now think about it this way. Again, going back to projects. We have to pay for these projects. How can we pay for them? By potentially reallocating resources from somewhere else. So hence we tax more. So this introduces inefficiencies into the economy. So you can see the link between potentially creating efficiencies in a given area, but then creating inefficiencies in another area. So what we essentially see is a distributional effect arising. We might be distributing a surplus away from smokers to another group that, let's say, uses the bridge. But assessing the distributional effects of a tax is a lot more complex than assessing efficiency benefits, because there are many groups in a society which will be impacted differently. So in practice, what governments do is they focus on a few measures of inequality, and because the poor, in other words, those are the worse off in a society of a particular concern, they receive special attention as a result. So the measures that are used to assess poverty, because these are the groups that are most vulnerable and the ones that we worry about most, is a so-called poverty index, which measures a fraction of the population whose income lies below a critical threshold. Below the threshold, individuals are considered to be poor. In 2010 in the US, the threshold for a family of four was $22,000. This is a lot higher than obviously in developing countries. Then what we also have is the poverty gap, and this measures how much income we would have to give to the poor to bring them all up to the poverty threshold as defined up above. So the idea is, are we reducing the poverty index or the poverty gap by undertaking specific projects? So you could think of it this way. There are some that are very high above the poverty threshold. So the idea is to redistribute from those individuals to these that are within the poverty threshold or live under the poverty threshold. So now, if you're interested in reading a little bit further, I would suggest that you look at these names, Michael Kremer, Abhijit Banerjee, and Esther Duflo, and these are developmental economists who are concerned with alleviating global poverty. So this will tie in to the discussions and the concepts presented in this lecture. Thank you.